Good morning to all listeners and viewers and participants for this breakfast seminar here at the Bergen Global, which is a collaboration between the University of Bergen and the Christian Michelsen Institute. At our breakfast seminars, we encourage people to attend or watch, even to send in questions and comments with their morning coffee and a breakfast snack in hand if you have. And accordingly, the style is conversational and rather than confrontational, but without shying away from differences in opinion or analysis. Today's meeting is based on a series of research projects on China and Africa based at the Christian Michelsen Institute and also in cooperation with the University of Bergen. It is also a part of a seminar series this spring where we have discussed the many general questions that often arise regarding China's growing involvement in Africa. Specific issues in that seminar series that we have dealt with have been China and industrial development in Ethiopia, the Chinese development aid, as well as how China relates to the growing African debt crisis. This morning's breakfast meeting is about, colloquially speaking, China's relations with African continental cooperation. I believe that our speakers today will analyze the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, the so-called FOCAC, that has emerged as the main political framework and vehicle for China's Africa engagement. Surely they will also discuss China's interaction with the African Union, which has also deepened over the past few years. What does China do through these platforms? How does China respond to African priorities and how balance its bilateral and multilateral engagements? Let me present then the three speakers that we have on our panel today. The first one is Dr. Ilaria Carozza, Senior Researcher at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. She has published a number of articles, papers, and book chapters about China and its diplomacy in Africa. The second speaker will be Dr. David Monyae, who I'm happy to say that we have now online from Johannesburg, I believe. Dr. Monyae, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, is co-director of the Center for China-Africa Studies, University of Johannesburg and Nanjing Tech University. He's an international relations and foreign policy expert and has previously served as the international relation analyst at the South African Parliament. The third speaker is my good colleague here at CMI, Elling Tjønneland, who for nearly 30 years has focused his research on African regional and continental cooperation. And he has also led a number of research projects on China in Africa from his base here at the Christian Michelsen Institute. With those words of introduction, I hope you have settled well in, and then I will invite the first speaker, Ilaria Carozza, who I believe will enlighten us on the evolution of and challenges to China-AU African Union relations, among other things. So please, Ilaria, the word is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to join this excellent seminar series. I would have, of course, preferred being there in person, but these be the times, so hopefully Zoom will do. So for the next 10 minutes, I will try to discuss the evolution and challenges of China's relations with the African Union, and I will focus specifically on peace and security cooperation, including, for example, peacekeeping and security force assistance, which are based on my research and fieldwork in Addis Ababa. So the short version is that the China-AU partnership was much celebrated as a step forward in China's overall engagement with the African continent. And while in many ways it is an important component of such engagement, these relations I don't think have delivered as much as at least China was hoping for. The long version is the following. So this relationship, again, has become closer in the last 2 years. Admitting the AU as a full member of the FOCAC in 2011 was arguably aimed at aligning China-Africa cooperation more generally with the AU's priorities and objectives, while simultaneously recognizing the organization's status as the major Pan-Africa institutional actor on matters of peace and security. And of course, in 2012, famously, China built the AU new headquarters, which then became a symbol, right, of this China-Africa relationship. So the same building, some may remember, was at the center of some accusations a few years back from a French newspaper that accused China of data theft. And then in 2015, China established a diplomatic mission to the AU. At the time, it was the third after the US and the EU. And this again was part of this effort to move beyond bilateral mechanisms, which have traditionally been the preferred channel for Sino-African relations up until then, and the establishment of the FOCAC. So as I'm sure Elling will also touch upon later, during the 2015 FOCAC summit, President Xi Jinping committed about 60 million in US dollars in free military aid or free aid to support the African standby force and the African capacity for immediate response to crisis. The following year, China donated 1.2 US million towards peace efforts in Somalia for the AU-led peacekeeping operation Amazon. And then finally, during the latest FOCAC, there were more commitments in free military aid and free military assistance. There was another 100 million committed to the African capacity for immediate response to crisis and the standby force. And furthermore, there were 50 security assistance programs that were promised to advance cooperation in the areas of law and order, UN peacekeeping missions, and fighting piracy and terrorism. And I will say a little bit more on these later. But despite these announcements and these contributions, I think that in dealing with the AU, Beijing has really encountered a series of challenges which are partly inherent in the organization itself and partly arise from the peculiarities, I would say, of China's diplomacy, which again heavily relies on government-to-government ties. So on one hand, you have the African peace and security architecture with the at the helm of which is the AU, which, however, again, faces a series of political and technical challenges and struggles still to build effective conflict resolution and post-conflict reconstruction mechanisms. In particular, I would say sovereignty still represents a central and very contested element, and it has often been instrumentalized by certain governments that have failed to provide security, welfare, and development for their citizens. Another issue is that some of the AU member states do not usually pay their annual fees, or they're very behind with their payments. And so up until very recently, at least the last data that I have, most of the funding for the organization comes from external donors, including the EU and the UN. So I think it was in 2018, actually, that the AU Commission for the first time released made its external financial audit publicly available for the period 2014-2017. And at the time, about 61% of the financing came from outside of the continent. So again, that sort of gives the impression that the body is really depending on external partners, on external funding. And this fact has unsurprisingly limited, I think, or at least up until very recently, has limited its effectiveness in decision making. And also it has brought in some debates the autonomy of its agenda in question. And I think also the problem is from within, in a sense, in terms of funding, because the distribution of funds from within the members themselves has mostly come from really 6 countries, from South Africa, Nigeria, Algeria, Angola, Egypt, and Libya, which again typically have covered about 60% of the budget. So once again, the sort of autonomy of the AU's priorities have been questioned in this sense, whether it's just a small faction of countries pursuing their own national interests. And so it seems that so far the AU has kind of not managed to promote the unity and solidarity that was essentially created for, its predecessor was created for. And then there's other issues, of course, when it comes to the coordination between the African Union and the regional economic communities. And I'm not going to go into it. I'm sure David will probably touch on that. And then on the other hand, you've got China, which again, despite its claims of the leading role in global security as a global security actor, still very much hesitates at getting more deeply or directly involved in the continent's peace and security dynamics. I will have to say that certainly the principles of respect for state sovereignty and non-interference, which are at the root of China's foreign policy, have been revised in time and adapted, adjusted to changing circumstances of China's engagement. But China is yet to intervene, in a sense, as such in any conflict, and it is still very reluctant to take positions on sensitive, often politicized issues. Of course, this doesn't mean that China hasn't been involved in certain situations on a number of occasions, and we can come back to this in the discussion. But I would say also that I think the primary motivation for China's military and security overtures abroad, including its military base in Djibouti, for example, was built in 2017, are really motivated by the need to protect its interests and citizens abroad, especially in light of its expanding activities as part of the Belt and Road, for example. So, and something that actually came up during my fieldwork in Addis Ababa that I was told in a number of interviews, Beijing seemed to expect from its efforts to cooperate with the AU as if it was a unitary Pan-African voice, but that didn't seem to be the case in a way. I was again told that one of the reasons why, for example, China hoped that opening this diplomatic mission in 2015 would, in a way, bring about change in its relations with the AU, is that leaders in Beijing thought that they could somewhat catch 50 plus birds with one stone. And again, I think in this case, China's aspirations to transcend bilateral mechanisms and deepen multilateral cooperation have been tempered really by the fragmented reality that it found in Addis Ababa. So I'll conclude with two concrete examples of China's engagement with the African peace and security architecture more broadly. So first of all, I think peacekeeping is really often mentioned as possibly the most important element of China's role as a security actor abroad, but this is done mostly via UN peacekeeping missions. So China has currently the personnel deployed to about 8 peacekeeping missions, including to Darfur, South Sudan, DRC, Mali, and the Central African Republic. And while these are indeed conducted in cooperation with the African Union and other sub-regional organizations, they are not led by the AU. When it comes to AMISOM, which is the AU-led, still supported by the UN, but it's operated by the AU, in Somalia, China, again, like I said before, provided money for equipment. It donated some equipment and made some donations in kind for the AU troops. And while I think this level of activism certainly is unprecedented for a country like China, which until the 90s, it wasn't really involved in any peacekeeping operation. Again, I would like to stress that this is done exclusively via the UN framework, where there is broad consensus and an international mandate. Secondly, and finally, apart from direct financial assistance, China also provides technical support, capacity building, training, and technologies to combat piracy, terrorism, and general instability or insecurity. So some of my recent research, for example, has focused on military training in particular. So earlier I mentioned that among the announcements made during the latest FOCAC summit, there were 50 security assistance programs. Now, with the caveat that there isn't a lot of public information, especially on the amount behind these funding, the data collection that I conducted with a colleague suggests that at least some of these programs were in fact provided bilaterally to a number of countries. For example, since 2018, there have been military assistance programs provided to Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Niger, the Gambia, Nigeria, the Republic of Congo, and AMISOM. So it seems that in the end, while big announcements are often made in the context of multilateral organizations and big gatherings with heads of state, that really comes down to diplomacy mostly, while the implementation and the delivery of any assistance is mainly dealt with by each recipient country individually. So again, I don't think we can exaggerate the role that the African Union practically plays in China's engagement with Africa's peace security more generally. So I'll end on this note, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. That was exactly 10 minutes, as you said, and thank you very much for this great opening and thought-provoking first intervention. Among other, I noted that you gave us this great caricatured allegory of China relating to the African Union as if it was trying to kill 50 birds with one stone, which I guess could be a somewhat a trope for the next interventions as well. With those words, can I invite Dr. Monyae? Okay, I think our second speaker will be Tjønneland. Before we move to Monyae. Will you give us your 10 minutes, Elling?
Thank you. I'll do my best, Aslak. In this seminar series, we've so far examined China's role as development actor in Africa along several dimensions. What has come out of that is, of course, not only that China is and has emerged in a relatively short period of time to become a quite important and significant development actor on the African continent. But furthermore, what has also been very striking is that China's engagement with Africa is largely at the bilateral level with individual countries. That's where we have the commercial engagement, we have the provision of development finance and development assistance, political engagement, and so on. At the multilateral arena, most of China's engagement on development issues has been at the global level. Recent years, we've seen when it comes to funding, we've seen that China has emerged as still a small but significant provider of funds to a number of multilateral development banks, perhaps especially the World Bank, where it at the last replenishment of the World Bank's soft lending window, which mostly goes to Africa, it was a major provider of funds for that. We've also seen that China is seconding officials to a number of UN agencies, UN secretariats, and so on. But above all, we see the engagement taking place in the diplomatic arena, at conferences, and so on. But a main pillar for China's engagement is what they call South-South cooperations. And a number of platforms have been established or used as vehicles for promotion of that. In relation to developing regions, a key instrument has been the establishment of a series of regional cooperation mechanisms, primarily with Africa, which I'll come back to, but also with Latin America, Caribbean, in Asia, and so on, and the Middle East. We've seen the Global Belt and Road Initiative have become important arena for China's South-South cooperation diplomacy. And recent documents from China also speak highly of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the so-called Agenda 2030, as a key platform for South-South cooperation. And China has established a number of also smaller things to highlight that. I've launched South-South Cooperation Fund with $3 billion, largely used to fund activities, projects within a range of UN agencies, as well as the Red Cross. I've established an South-South Institute in China, at Peking University, and so on. But what is also very striking in China's South-South diplomacy is its strong emphasis on China being an equal partner and a different partner from the West, because China is a developing country which brings an added value, added dimension, important lessons for other developing countries. And China's role in the economic area in South-South cooperation is significant. Although I could end this section by also saying that if you look at numbers, China's engagement is small compared to the size of China's economy. China is now the world's second largest economy. It will soon become the largest. And compared to the other large economies of the world, its engagement is still small, but important. But then let's turn to the African Union and the establishment of the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation. This was a Chinese initiative in the late 1990s, where they set up this, initiated and launched this platform in 2000. And since then, it has met every 3 years, and those summits and ministerial meetings have been used by China to launch, in cooperation with African countries, major action plans covering the next 3 years. The last meeting was summit was in Beijing in 2018, which launched the 3-year program covering period 2019 to 21. And this has been China's preferred platform arena for launching or making announcements at the Pan-African level. Allocation of funds under the program has almost solely been through bilateral decisions, at the bilateral level done by China. Very little has been used to, funding has been provided either directly to the AU for the AU to distribute. This contrasts, if you like, with, say, the experience of India, which has a similar but at a much smaller level engagement with Africa, where it uses the AU to distribute and allocate funding to member countries. In fact, the arrival of the AU, as Ilaria pointed out, was also a bit late in China's FOCAC engagement. Formally, the AU became a member of FOCAC in 2015. Diplomatic missions was then established. The AU has a diplomatic mission in Beijing. China has one at the AU in Addis, and so on. And it's clear that China wants AU to play a big role in its engagement with Africa, but I've struggled, as Ilaria pointed out, with making that work. If we look at what they actually do in relation to the AU, we find that it is primarily an arena for political engagement, dialogue with Africa at the continental level. Direct funding has been very, very limited. Its most has been provided in kind, such as the perhaps first engagement with the AU, major engagement, which was the provision of the AU headquarters in AU, completed, I think it was in 2012. But China has, through FOCAC and also outside FOCAC, directly with EU, launched a number of initiatives. Most of these are within the area of peace and security, which I will not go into, and that was covered well by Ilaria, but there are a few other initiatives which is worth mentioning, which says something about how China thinks and how China addresses these issues, but also some of the challenges and shortcomings of what they are doing or trying to do in relation to the EU. Perhaps the most important thing has been within the health sector, which has always been an important, although perhaps small, but still a significant dimension of China's engagement with Africa, predating the current commercial expansion, going back to the late 1950s. But this has been scaled up, and it has been given an added dimension by the COVID-19 pandemic. Back a couple of years ago, China offered to fund and build the headquarters of the AU specialized agency, the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which became important linked to the Ebola pandemic in West Africa a few years ago, and has since been developed as a key instrument for a continental approach to address and deal with pandemics. And of course, with the COVID-19, there's an added urgency to that. And then China decided that its previous offers to provide a headquarter for that agency should be fast-tracked. And I believe it was late last year that they provided funding. That is, it was a kind of an in-kind support where the Chinese construction company was then hired to build the headquarters, also to be located in Addis Ababa. But the engagement with that agency has primarily been around providing in-kind support, setting up the building. There has been, so far, this can change, been little technical advice, support to the African Center. There's been little or no, as far as I know, provision of funding for its operational programs. There's been little engagement with the centers and the AU's vaccine acquisition task team, which is in the business of acquiring vaccines for Africa. This can change. There's another Pan-African institution, the African Export-Import Bank, which is now just guaranteed for Africa through that African Center for the procurement of 220 million doses of vaccines. China is already engaging with that bank, providing loans to it, and it could be expanded to also cover procurement of vaccines. But so far, China's engagement here has mainly been at the bilateral level by providing first protective gear and testing equipment and so on, but more recently also vaccines from China to countries. So that's the health sector. Currently, of course, the most important sector in addition to peace and security. At the 2018 FOCAC summit, it was also agreed between China and Africa that China should fund an African, China should work with the EU on an infrastructure cooperation plan. To be formulated, as it says. And this is important, but not much has happened there. It's important also because both the EU has its grand plan for continental priorities when it comes to what needs to be done in infrastructure development, but also because China's significant engagement in infrastructure has largely been at the country level, and it doesn't always align well with EU priorities. Similar is happening within agriculture. And the third area is capacity building training, which China has also emphasized. I would like to support. Not much has happened. What they are doing is they will support the providing of physical facilities for another specialized AU agency, the African Capacity Building Foundation in Harare, but not much has happened to that. What is missing, I'm now approaching the end, Aslak, what is missing from China's engagement is there's very little financial support to AU programs compared to other external partners. There is very little engagement or no engagement with AU's governance agenda, its Charter on Democracy, Elections, Governance. There is significant engagement when relating to peace and security, but only on certain dimensions of the AU's priorities, namely on the military side, peace support operations, and so on. Finally, compared to other external partners to the AU, China is delivering far less funding. Hardly anything. It brings perhaps other priorities like economic development, infrastructure to the table, and it downplays other aspects of the AU's agenda, which has been strongly promoted by other external partners, governance issues, peace, security. But thirdly, China listens to Africa. It's important to note that. And although China is very reluctant to engage in internal conflicts, it will be difficult for China to take other positions, say at the UN Security Council on African issues, which is not supported by Africa. So in that sense, they listens. And finally, there is very little cooperation and coordination between China and other external partners. That is both when it comes to the traditional northern or western donors, but also with other south donors, such as those in the BRICS alliance, India and Russia and so on. But all in all, China's engagement has probably also increased the AU's bargaining power in relations to external partners. Thank you, Aslak.
Thank you very much, Elling. On a personal account, I would like to state that I am listening and learning from the speakers so far, and I'm likely to think that you gave an almost comprehensive tour of the Chinese diplomatic and network that forms its infrastructure in Africa, so the organizational is in a network and infrastructure in Africa. Having said that, we have this far discussed from an admittedly we have discussed South-South cooperation from an admittedly northern perspective. So I'm happy then to invite a distinguished speaker, Dr. Monyae, who is based in the South. So, Dr. Monyae, we have you on sound? Yes. There? Good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing well.
Yes. Are you ready to give us your 10 minutes or so?
Thank you. Firstly, thank you all colleagues, and it is a great pleasure and honor for me to be invited to this special event, and the organizers and all colleagues. Unfortunately, I won't be able to join you physically, but to be able to communicate and continue with our endeavors. Having said that, my colleagues have covered ground, and I'm just wondering what else can I add? They have comprehensively covered most aspects. Perhaps my role is to really, for lack of a better term.
Dr. Monyae, I have to interrupt you there because your sound quality is very low. So
Okay.
We are only hearing you in bits and pieces. Can we ask you to first try and log off and log in again? See if it improves the situation.
I'll do that. Thank
Very
you.
quickly. Yeah. Apologies to our viewers. Yeah. Well, I think we, as well as our viewers, are by now used to these technical difficulties and limitations of the Zoom technology, of the Zoom era.
Western technology.
Western technology. Seems we have Dr. Monyae. Dr. Monyae, you're back online.
Hello, yes, can you hear me? Is it better?
It's slightly better. Let's
Hello?
give it a shot. If it doesn't work now, we'll try without the video for a while. But
Okay.
Please try again.
Oh, okay. My role, again, thank you for having such wonderful presentations and event. My role is somehow to swim against the current. I would like to present much more of Africa's response. There are quite a number of assumptions that all of us as scholars make. Africa, let me continue without the video. I hope it's better. Just give me a sign if it's okay. What I'll do is look at Africa and say the African continent, the largest continent with 55 countries. It has, unlike European Union and other continents, it is the weakest in international relation. And therefore, when we talk about Africa, we tend to look at it as if all other global players are doing something to Africa, and Africa itself does not have agents. I think I'm moving from the other opposite side, that Africa appears disjointed, weak, uncoordinated in so many ways. However, there is madness in its method. It is weak within international relation. So from international relation theory, I think the best way to describe Africa is to use the bandwagoning theory, where the weak members of international relation, country member states, tend to pick back on the powerful countries to achieve their own. And therefore, I think if we look at the OAU and now AU, it has really tried its best to work with the international community, to work with the most powerful countries in the world, somehow pick back on the power of these various actors in international relation to be able to achieve its own collective interest, at times individual member state interests. So in doing so, there are a lot of advantages and there are also lots of disadvantages. So when it comes to China, so much views that are coming primarily from the West tend to look at Africa in so many ways, at times patronizing, at times as if describing Africa as if Africa itself does not have agents. And I would like to put it that Africa has agents. Africa has well-coordinated approach, how it approaches China and all other actors. And therefore, specifically with China, there are two major areas where Africa responds to China. Firstly is the historical colonial and imperialism era, the formation of OAU 1963 and China 1949 to 1978, with the change of China from an ideological to a much more pragmatic and opening up. And that relation was much more political. And as we all know, Africa responded to China in that era in a way of helping bring in China, normalizing China, an isolated post-1949 Chairman Mao China into United Nations Security Council in 1971. And I think Africa has been working in a way to give legitimacy to China rightful right within international organization, primarily United Nations and other agencies, G77 plus China. There's also the other element that came, which is much more central within the global South, particularly Asia and Africa. That is 1955, the Bandung Conference. That was much more central from a political. And throughout the 1960s and 70s, China's first major operation on the continent, other than helping nationalist movements in terms of fighting colonial powers, it also physically helped Zambia and Tanzania with the Tazara, which became the central flagship of China infrastructure development that we can go back to. So the current events are not divorced from that first stage, particularly if you look at a global South perspective, and you look at it from the non-alignment movement, as well as the Bandung Conference, because major issues of alienation and marginalization of Asia and Africa came in the Bandung Conference. And those issues are not yet completed, are still on. Whether we look at alienation from the health, global health, supply chain, value chain, or you look at it, infrastructure or global financing, the IFIs or DFIs, global financial institutions, Africa is at a receiving end. So in the interest of time, I won't speak much of the historical, but my major point is to say what's happening and how Africa is responding to China is largely informed by these historical perspectives that my colleague have alluded to, particularly on the global South aspect. But the Bandung Conference and the outcome of Bandung Conference is quite central in this regard. In the post-1978 and now, how has Africa responded to China? It should not seen in isolation of the AU's transformation from the OAU to AU. I think the thinking among African head of states and governments was that there is a need to transform the organization to be able to firstly have its agency. Number two, instead of going in your autarky way that Africa, as was the case in the transformation of OAU to AU, the AU is much more informed by the view that they need to invite all major powers to contribute to Africa's development. And we have the NEPAD process, we have the APRM process, we have quite a number of partners with the international community as the African Union. I think if you look at the AU's strategic partnership document, it defines the need for Africa to open up and have relationship with the EU, with major powers, United States, Japan, Germany, France, and quite a number of others, including the Arab League. And in doing so, I think the thinking is that we could then piggyback on the strength of these actors to advance Africa's own development. And therefore, in this relation, since the the establishment of the AU, of all actors on the African continent at the moment, Africa has come quite strongly in a number of ways. Firstly, my previous colleague has mentioned that it is the second largest economy in the world. However, China also distinctively stands alone. It does not share a Western world OECD's norms and values. It does not share issues of economic structural adjustment programs. It does not share your democratic Western norms and values. It carries its own perspective and in its own thinking. And to some extent, some African countries share that element that there is a need of transforming the post-1945 world order, bringing in all actors, Africa's representation in those institutions, and therefore, from Africa's perspective, is as much as we work with the United States, European Union, and other actors, China need to be brought in and strengthen that relationship to achieve Africa's visibility, Africa's own voice in global arena. So in a nutshell, it does not mean that the AU looks the other side and does not have issues with China. The AU has a lot of disagreement with China. But the approach, how the AU respond to China, differs from how your Western empires, and I say Western, I'm not bringing the Western as a monolith. Western countries do differ. We're quite aware of that. However, the bulk of Western countries tend to say Africa just follow China in a manner that it does not have its own interest, does not speak with one voice. There are weaknesses, however, within AU itself. Firstly, it is not structured as EU. It does not have a permanent secretariat. Head of states and government have more power, and therefore, the agreements at African Union level are not in most instances implemented in a coherent and a concrete way. China tends to use bilateral when it suits it, and multilateral, AU in particular, on the other hand. And therefore, it's a strategy that China has. And in most instances, I tend to say it doesn't help us to criticize China for choosing that strategy. I think criticism should be on the Africans themselves that do not have a concrete strategy towards China. They do talk around and rally around the African Agenda 2063. However, Agenda 2063 is much more visionary. It is not a program. And Agenda 2063, African Agenda 2063 somehow has areas of convergence with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Somehow it has convergence with China on health issues that my colleagues have alluded to, particularly with how China responded to Ebola, how it is responding to the pandemic COVID-19, and how China is fashioning its Belt Road physical infrastructure, particularly in Ethiopia, Nigeria, Kenya, Mombasa, Nairobi, and now going to Nairobi into Uganda via Naivasha, and quite a number of other projects. However, there are clashes where the differences in terms of the so-called debt trap and views, but these views has to be understood that at the African continent, there's so much contestation. Former European countries, colonial powers, still want to maintain their dominance. United States as the global hegemony power, wants to maintain its hegemony, and therefore China's so-called debt trap, it's much more little. It's less than 20% in terms of Africa's debt. The bulk debt that Africa has is with Western countries. However, the manner in which it is negotiated, it is structured, it differs from an OECD, as I had already mentioned. Therefore, this brings all sorts of issues. In conclusion, in the interest of time, I would like to say, perhaps it will come in the discussions, that going forward with the Biden administration, I think we're going to see a number of tensions rising, and that Africa will be constantly asked to align with the Western world in condemning China, whether on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, what's happening in Xinjiang. And it's quite difficult for the African continent to do so. And I doubt very much if the African continent will openly criticize China on human rights issues. Why? Because let's look at history. Africa cannot endorse Britain's views on Hong Kong. It's a colonial conquest of Hong Kong. And even though the issues come in human rights issues, the entire existence of Hong Kong, it's an imperial colonial language. And to expect the African continent to endorse those views, it will be quite difficult for the continent. Taiwan is the same issue. The views from China somehow are shared on the African continent, that we do stay away. We would like to see Muslim countries' views, the Arab League and others, on Xinjiang, given the Muslim and Turkey, to take a lead on what's happening in Xinjiang. Africa would support views other than the Western view on Xinjiang, Hong Kong. So I think we're going to see the demonization of human rights language, given what I said, European countries are in Afghanistan in so many places, so much atrocities, whether drone bombings or generally genocide in Yemen that we know. So let me conclude by saying we are going to hear more. Africa does speak with one voice. It matters, however, the weaknesses and tension that Africa has with China on human rights and treatment of Africans in China are issues that are being discussed, but not in the open. I would like to thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Monyae. I believe we lost the last few seconds there as you switched on the camera again, but when the last bits I recorded was that you positioned Africa sort of in the squeeze between Western powers and China. Which is of course a good picture to start off the debate. We have about 35 minutes for discussion, debates, and also would like to encourage the viewers and listeners to send questions if they have any. With that, I'll invite Elling, who I believe had a question to Dr. Monyae.
Well, thank you, Aslak, and thank you to both speakers. I have a question to each of you. First, David, thank you for your presentation. And I think one thing that I derive from this, what I fully agree, is that whatever China has been doing and not doing in Africa, it has contributed to a situation where Africa, or African countries, and the AU is able to speak and to engage internationally in a more independent way. It has increased the bargaining power of Africa. So that is an observation. But I want you to elaborate a bit on more critical responses to China's engagement, which has emerged, perhaps especially over the past year in Africa. We've seen newspaper reports appear in the north from African newspapers and so on, with very critical responses from African, both from the civil society, but also from African governments in the wake of the incidents in Guangzhou in China, which led to accusations from Africa for Chinese racism. What's your take on this? Is that something which has been solved? Are the things been running more smoothly now, or is that still an issue which is out there in Africa? And has it gained momentum with the more challenges facing China-Africa relations in the wake of the COVID-19 and the debt situation for many African countries? And some of them, China is a very important major creditor, and does Africa view China's role as a creditor different from how they view the World Bank and Western lenders and their performance in Africa? So that was my question to you, David. A question to Ilaria.
I think we should take one at a time.
Okay.
Yeah. David, would you like to?
Sure, I'll be very quick. And
quick
thank
response,
you.
Yes.
Sure, I'll be very. Thank you for a wonderful question. Great question. I was one of those people who had opinions with the Guangzhou racism that came.
Monyae,
okay.
I believe you need to switch off the camera.
Sure.
Unless we can't hear you.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm trying to do. I'm just blocked from switching it off. Can the
okay. So we'll ask you to log off and log in again, and in the meantime, we'll take a question for Ilaria. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Well, yeah, thank you also to Ilaria for a very interesting presentation. You hinted at it, but I would like you to the extent possible, to dig more into what China is doing with in relations to the AU's African peace and security agenda. More specifically, you mentioned the priority given to military dimension, to peacekeeping, and so on. But significantly, there is also other dimensions to the AU's security architecture when it comes to mediation, engagement in intervention in domestic affairs, and so on, and the mechanisms they have in place there. How has this, has there been any engagement or dialogue between China and the AU on these sort of more sensitive political issues?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think we have to look at in order to answer this question, we have to look at very briefly the differences between the AU's approach to non-interference or non-intervention and China's, and then see if there's any convergence. Because on the one hand, the AU's predecessor, so the Organization of African Unity, did not have legal power to get involved in any conflicts on the continent, and was in fact largely inactive on this front. Whereas the AU, and part of the reason why it changed was also to allow it to have the right to intervene in a member state with respect to war crimes, for example, genocide or other crimes against humanity. And so those provisions have come to be termed what non-indifferent, which is essentially the AU equivalent of the R2P UN-endorsed norm, the responsibility to protect. So again, under this framework, the AU is allowed to intervene in a member state following a decision by an assembly of heads of states of member countries, or when members themselves request an intervention to restore peace and security. So examples of these principles are, for instance, its deployment of a peacekeeping force in Darfur in the beginning of the 2000s, which later transformed into a hybrid AU-UN operation. And of course, what I mentioned already, the mission in Somalia, AMISOM. And then there are other instances, for example, during the Libya crisis, where the AU's role in this sense, in terms of military intervention, was overshadowed by other regional and international actors. So that's from the AU side. Now, China's position for on non-intervention and non-interference is, on principle, a bit different, right? Because it is formally enshrined by the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, to which Beijing has adhered since the official inception of the principles in 1954, of course, with the exception of the Cultural Revolution. But it has been sticking to these principles essentially as they have served convenient means to support its realpolitik, essentially, in addition to economic considerations, in both its foreign and domestic policy. However, I will also say that China's view on these principles have changed, or has had to change, in a sense. The sanctity of the state sovereignty principle has inevitably been transformed, as I hinted at earlier, especially as its engagement deepens in many countries in the global south. And so China has kind of come to accept some of the ideas that go beyond, these principles. So it has accepted the responsibility to protect concept, even though it's made adjustments to it. And while this seems to contradict, in a way, the 5 principles, again, this is it's an adjustment, it's an adaptation, right, of concept to a situation where China doesn't really, it can't just shy away anymore. Now, when it comes to engagement with the AU, again, I would say that any involvement has mostly been through bilateral. I wouldn't necessarily even call them interventions, but I mean, during the Libya crisis in the civil war in 2011, China just had to pull out its citizens, mobilizing massive resources, doing something that it's never done before. And similarly, when it sort of participated or helped mediation efforts between Sudan and South Sudan, that has been done at the bilateral level. I don't think we have seen yet this in terms of mediation and other kinds of security engagement that is not either military assistance or peacekeeping. I am yet to see a more active role or a more active dialogue, as you said, between China and the AU, mostly because, again, despite the changes in China's rhetoric around these principles of non-interventions and respect for state sovereignty, the approach of the AU doesn't really align with China. China doesn't want to get involved unless it has to. Again, the Libya situation was a crisis, and that prompted more military engagement abroad, but China doesn't want to get engaged militarily abroad unless it has to. And I think that situations in South China Sea and the borders with India, China considers them very much domestic policy, not foreign policy. So I think abroad, it really still shies away very much. Now, mediation, of course, China, again, in South Sudan, but also in other places, Afghanistan and Myanmar, it has made overtures. But I think, like, going back to what you said earlier, this is just very much at the diplomatic international level. I'm yet to see more engagement and dialogue with the AU, unlike, for example, other external partners that have been I mean, what I said earlier about China catching 50 plus birds with one stone, another thing that came up, for instance, during my fieldwork interviews is that when the AU was created out of the OAU, European consultants have been sort of hanging around in the Peace and Security Department. Actually, the building itself was built with German funds. And China was a latecomer in that sense, right? As much as the AU was a latecomer to China's engagement in Africa, so was the other way around, I would say. So I think, yeah, we'll have to wait. Perhaps, if anything, the UN, I would say, would be more of a platform for China's deeper engagement with conflict mediation than the AU itself, at least so far.
Thank you, Ilaria. And with the danger of slightly jumping in the discussions here, I'm now happy to say that we have Dr. Monyae back on. Are you there with us?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, and so I would ask you to reply to Elling's questions, which was broadly on controversies related to racism in China, COVID questions, and China as a creditor in Africa.
Indeed. Thank you for a wonderful question. Yeah, firstly, I don't think Africa views China's debt as different from Western debt. Debt remains a debt, and it is seen in the same way, and concerns on the African continent are quite high, as much they have concern with Western countries. I think the point that I've been trying to make is that Africa sees China's involvement as a way of broadening the global infrastructure financing, giving Africa more voice and options. Unlike in your 60s, 70s, and 80s, particularly with the economic structural adjustment program that have damaged Africa largely, with the pandemic, if you look at it, the rolling back of the state, encouraged by World Bank and Western countries, is a direct result of what is happening now, and lack of health infrastructure on the African continent. And therefore, I think what most African countries like China, as much as giving them that option, that we can speak with the French, the Germans, the Chinese, the Japanese, and in so doing, it gives them a leverage in negotiating a better deals outcome with lenders. And therefore, China, to directly answer, it's viewed like any other lender on the African continent. Africa does not achieve what it wants, and therefore it's problematic to look at Africa as one. Some countries are negotiating these things from a better position, better negotiating skills. You can't compare Ethiopia loan negotiations with Kenya, nor can you compare that with Malawi. These are different countries. They are not the same. And therefore, some deals are good, some deals are bad, as much as with other lenders. And therefore, I think my view is that what China has done, more than any of current international players on the African continent, is to bring back the international community, most importantly, powerful countries, back to Africa, however, differently. It's no longer looking at Africa as the British. I think it was Tony Blair who said it's a stain on Western conscience, in a patronizing language that is used, or the economists, that Africa is hopeless, in a much more serious way, that these players are finding competition, and if they don't enter into Africa now, they will be left out. China is bringing new ways, and in itself, Africans are not naive, looking at China as a savior of some sort better than the West. It's not seen that way. However, there are certain ways that has broadened space for African countries when they China in that in that kind of way. Coming to racism, there are views within the global South that Africans and Asians, because they both suffered at the hands of Western imperialism, racism, and conquer, and 100 years of humiliation that China suffered from Western countries, Africa faced more or less the same, brutalized, undermined, laughed at, and even the education system, which persists to this stage. The impact of that era does not mean, therefore, Africans and Chinese won't have certain racist views of each other. I think what we saw in Gonjo, the African continent responded sharply, and Nigeria and quite a number of African leaders responded to China, criticizing that. And I have an opinion piece on the very same issue. How does that differ from racism from the West? One is the Gonjo crisis. As much as there might be so many differences, Africans and Chinese, as they interact and their relationship expanding trade and people to people, and the number of negative issues that also come from Africans in terms of how they're treated in China. However, the Chinese government responded quite harshly to its own people, and dealing with it in responding to concerns of Africans. At the same time, we see a continued narratives of racism from the West, even worse. While Gonjo is happening, we had George Floyd, and therefore George Floyd's story undermined the entire Gonjo narrative, that Africa is focusing on George Floyd more than it is focusing on in China in that regard. And even now, African continent is looking at how people of Asian descent are being treated in America and a number of Western countries. Your rise, right-wing politics in the West, in Europe, right-wing governments that are coming into power, and the kind of views that they have makes it China's issues look better, but that does not mean it's perfect and Africans are just embracing what's happening, negative treatment of Africans. I think they differ in the sense that behind closed doors, these issues are raised. The trade imbalance between Africa and China is being raised. In 2018, and I was privileged to attend that conference, including the Second Belt conference chaired by President Xi Jinping. These issues are Africans do raise, but it doesn't come in the newspapers in your Western kind of fashion. So that's how, let me pause there in the interest of time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ilaria, I believe you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, actually, I have a question also on this, or perhaps a follow-up for David, in the sense that I have noticed a lot of the issues on on racism against Black people and Africans in China was huge in the news and in the debates within academics, especially people that work on China, Africa specifically, and then it disappeared. So it was talked about for, again, as you mentioned, both from civil society and also from government. But then at some point, I couldn't see anything anymore. So it seemed as almost as if it was, I wouldn't say buried, but I wonder, is there still the active debate going on and we just don't see it? Or has it sort of been, again, pushed away because in the interest of the partnership between China and African countries?
Dr. Monyae.
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that those issues, the relationship between Africans and Chinese has always been at the very highest level. highest level in the terms of politicians, and now lately business people and all these aspects, people, some of us who travel to China and Chinese that travel on the African continent. And our interaction differs because it's at the highest level. It's elite interaction with much more respect. And I've been to China more than 30 times. And I can't, other than being seen as a Black person and young kids swarming around me, touching my skin, wants to take pictures with me, which if it happens in the Western countries, I would be angry. In China, there's that sense that they're newcomers, the first time they see a Black person. But I haven't had personally any experience of being treated differently because of the color of my skin. I've had those instances in most Western countries, but that does not mean that other ordinary Africans in China are treated the same. No, there are traders. I think if you want to see this, you go to Guangzhou. There's even a place called African chocolate. It's something that I find derogative to me, calling a place where Black people are concentrated. I mean, we call Chinatowns. I think the African town, it's then called the chocolate in Guangzhou, which is terrible. Those ladies that go and buy clothes, and I mean, if you go in Ethiopia Airways, Guangzhou, Addis Ababa, you then get a better view of ordinary Africans and their experience in China than from me as an African elite. I go to 5-star hotels. I don't sleep on the in 1 or 2nd or 3rd-star hotels. So the treatment is quite different. There are issues, to answer you directly, but at a government level, if you look at the communique of the Chinese government, it responded speedily on the key areas from some interaction I had with the Association of Africans in Guangzhou and so many other places, that the Chinese government put a very hard law of not allowing the bad treatment of Africans, particularly not allowed to get into shops, not allowed to book certain hotels because they are Africans. I think it took a drastic measure to respond to such those kind of treatments, and provincial governments and local governments in China understood the danger of those kind of behavior from their own people, given the fact that China is trying to go to the world and there are more Chinese on the African continent. Perhaps let me also add, it does not mean that Africans are not racist to Chinese. We have endless issues of racism here in Johannesburg. Chinese treated badly by fellow Africans. They're called names, and there were all sorts of issues. It doesn't reach a level as in most Western countries where they're either killed or there were cases in Uganda where some were killed in Zambia, but it's not at that scale as in what's happening in the United States. So therefore, we have looked at it. However, they're being handled much better behind closed doors. But what's worsening the entire racism at a global level narrative is that under Donald Trump and changes in Europe, Mediterranean, where Africans are dying, and the European Union is just looking at the death of Africans as if it's nothing. They can intervene, but they choose not to assist Africans dying in the Mediterranean. So the entire narrative of racism at a global level, it's not in favor of a view coming from the West. Africans measure, they tend to see the West as worse off than China. But this is a perception, it's not shared by all Africans. It's my own observations, seeing how the entire Guangzhou story has died and killed by George Floyd, in my view.
Thank you, David.
So Thank you very much, Dr. Monyae, for that very nuanced perspective and your thoughts, also very personal, about these issues that Ilaria raised. I have a question to the panel, and that is a quite overall, on an overall level. I think in particular, Dr. Monyae has stressed different aspects of China's relations with Africa, or articulated them. And one narrative is the Chinese narrative as China as a special, China's special relationship with Africa as somewhat a different actor than the collectivity of the Western countries. China as being anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, in favor of South-South cooperation, being a non-interventionist actor that doesn't push its own values and policies on the African continent as does the Western powers. But then, on the other hand, we have discussed how Africans and the African organizations relate to China and the Western powers now, or as a great power, or China also as a great power, meaning, and in particular, as Dr. Monyae stressed, China as China's increasing influence has given Africa more options. And so my question then is, seen as, or if you take the position of the African Union, for instance, as an expression of, insofar as it is an expression of an African collectivity, is this, does it view China now as a special friendly partner, or is it just another great power that it has to relate to? Was that a clear question? Yeah, I think there's some nodding. Elling, would Ilaria or Dr. Monyae, who would like to answer that?
I'm happy to. I can answer, but also Elling hasn't talked for a while, so maybe he can go first.
Ilaria, you go first.
Okay. I think the key lies into that gap that I was hinting at between the rhetoric and the practice of China's participation in, you know, peace and security abroad or other areas for that matter, and that sort of emphasis on South-South cooperation and on being different and having a different approach. I mean, the security development nexus, which is the key, I would say, to China's approach to, again, many different areas, is not a new concept. It's not a Chinese concept. It's a very Western liberal concept with some variation, of course. So I wouldn't go as far as saying that the Chinese approach and the Western approach are the same, at least not to peacekeeping and peace building, but they are also, you know, in that particular link between stability and peace and economic development, they're not too different. That was one of the reasons I think where China was so successful in a sense in promoting this approach, right, as different, is because it used, in its narrative, in its stories, in its rhetoric, it used familiar language, it used familiar names and norms for its approach. And then of course, it's the issue of not, like Elling touched upon that, you know, it doesn't respond to priorities such as governance, democracy, and elections. But on other issues, I think it's more rhetoric really than practice. And so I don't see, what I came across again in Addis Ababa was this feeling from people working, especially at the Peace and Security Department of the AU, of this feeling of China really still not knowing how to go about the organization because of what I mentioned earlier, being a relative latecomer. I think, like David mentioned, that they see China as yet another opportunity, as yet another partner, as yet another option, right, that they have to tap into if they need help. I don't really see how the AU views it as substantially different, and especially as we said earlier, its contributions are actually fairly small. So even its contributions in kind compared to other countries such as the US, I mean, when it comes to military assistance and military training, Again, China contributes for something about few $100 million in US dollars, maybe. The US contributes billions. So yeah, I don't think that China is there yet in that sense.
Yeah. Thank you, Ilaria.
Okay.
Dr. Monyae, please.
Sure. I share my colleagues' views on that. I think when we look at a major point from my side is that one, China's expansion as a non-Western country and becoming the second biggest economy has brought shockwaves to the world. It is changing, it's bringing anxiety. The post-1945 world order is shifting as we speak. And that shift is going to Asia. And the ranking of countries in terms of economic power and otherwise is constantly changing. And therefore, I think we have to look at China differently. But from Africa's perspective, it's just a question of balancing. Africa looks at rise of China. And when I say Africa, I mean African elite in particular, who are in constant interaction with China. That leeway gives them options, whether in security issues, as much as my colleagues has said in dollar and cents, US might be contributing more. China is contributing differently, but more impactful. For instance, African countries never had eyes in terms of in the airspace, cyber security. With the rise of Chinese giant space relation with Ethiopia, for instance, and Nigeria, and quite a number of Africans are now getting certain views that they previously had no access to. So in that sense, there are challenges, whether the African headquarters and issues of Chinese, allegation of Chinese spying, for instance, was a huge issue. But the bigger question is that who is not spying on Africans? The Americans are leading spying on Africa. Europeans are spying on Africa, and China is also spying. The role of states is spying is the core business of states. And therefore, to ask Africans to point at China on spying and ignoring what Snowden is telling us on what's happening in spying, it then becomes a problem. And therefore, when Africans don't raise their voice harshly on China, it has to be understood in that context. China, on the other hand, is perceived independent of Western views. I've carried research in Ethiopia and Kenya and see some of the norms and views of ordinary Africans. For instance, a classical example is the economic industrial zones in Ethiopia. Speaking with workers on the ground, they have good stories about China, and they also have bad issues, where traditionally they differ in terms of how work is done, culture of working is done, working at night, working during the day. Trade unions have issues with Chinese investments in most, particularly in my own country in South Africa. Heavy issues in terms of workers' rights, which differ from China in itself. And therefore, Africa finds itself benefiting and at the same time having a negative impact of this change that is taking place. An interesting story in Kenya, ordinary workers and African elites who are now operating their own work, and African companies are adopting Chinese working way. African companies that are now working at night, for instance, something unheard of on the African continent. So overall, in a nutshell, China's rise is bringing lots of positive as well as negative. The international global system is changing, and China is fighting for space. So is Africa, and therefore Africa will rely on Western countries as much as China to open its own international system.
Thank you, Dr. Monyae. Can I interrupt you there, because we are actually approaching the end of this breakfast seminar. Can I invite back Elling for a last comment?
Yes, thank you. Just three final comments from me. China is a new major power on the African continent. There are many parallels to what China is doing compared to the traditional northern or Western powers, but there are also differences. China has a different way of approaching Africa, much less talk about conditionalities and so on, and they treat Africans much more as equal partners. So that is an important dimension. But the way they operate, the trade patterns, investment patterns, and so on, are many parallels to what Western powers have been doing for decades in Africa. So I would say that I would like to highlight two other points, two challenges for China, two things to watch. The first, what is happening to the ideology of South-South cooperation? It is not just about China being able to interact with each and every African countries under a South-South umbrella. There are other South countries, Southern powers being active on the African continent, and more so in the future than we've seen now. Other Asian countries, not just India, but also other Asian countries, Arab countries, Latin American countries. How is China going to interact with them? And that has been a challenge so far. China goes it alone. And the third comment from me is, what is happening with China as a result of its engagement in Africa? China approached Africa differently, but they are facing many of the same challenges as other outside actors, Western and non-Western, in their engagement with the continent. They might come with the idea of not interfering. They might come with the idea that we need to build infrastructure and get the economy going. But then they into the problems of sustainability, management, lack of capacity, internal conflicts. How will China address this? And how will they learn from their African experiences? That is something to watch.
Thank you very much for those wise words, Elling. I believe there were some questions in there as well. Unfortunately, we won't have time to delve into that. It will have to be part of the global conversation that hopefully we have given a small contribution to along this breakfast seminar from our vantage points of Bergen, Oslo, and Johannesburg. Before long, we'll be meeting in conferences around the globe, continuing the conversation, I hope. My name is Aslak Orre, a researcher here at the Christian Michelsen Institute. I would like, on behalf of Bergen Global, I would like to give a round of applause to our three panelists, Dr. David Monyae, Dr. Ilaria Carozza, and in Oslo, and here at my side, Elling Tjønneland. Thank you very much.